All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Expected by Whom. And today we got kind of an interesting way to kick this one off. Sean, you've been spending some time at the coaches conference, and you've gotten to hear from a lot of folks involved in the world of hockey, including Red Wings coach Derek Lalonde gave a nice talk. What are some of the highlights that you've seen? And, one of the things you had mentioned to me is there's maybe been some innovative ways that hockey-minded folks have found to implement analytics to help their rosters and really help their team succeed.
Yeah, it's I feel like my location, your podcast location is always nicely framed with the Lidstrom jersey in the background, and mine goes from my front porch to a random room that I kind of sequestered somewhere here on the campus over at the University of Michigan to, I'm sure, to daylight disappearing. So like my background has been constantly changing. This is a one-time background, I think, for me. But yeah, I'm here. There's a 3-day coaches conference over on the campus at Michigan today, run by a group called the Coaches Site. And I am not a coach. I've had a couple people come up to me and ask me who you coach for, because everyone gets these lanyards that say who you coach for, and mine doesn't say anything. It just says my name. And I'm just the intrepid reporter that was willing to take time out of their week and pay some money to go hear people talk about hockey. So that's what I've been doing here. And it's I love this kind of stuff, because when you go to, you get kind of the uncut, unmedia diagnosed versions of how coaches think. Like yesterday, Derek Lalonde spoke yesterday and broke down the power play, and he literally went through all of the power play clips he showed, because Derek Lalonde didn't run the power play for the Red Wings this year, right? That's Alex Tanguay's role, but he ran through all of the clips and introed basically how he introduced the power play to Team USA for World Championships, because he ran the power play on David Quinn's staff at Worlds. And there's little things, and I'm not going to go through all of those because I need to save some things to write about for another day to get people to actually read my stuff. But there's little things about the Red Wings power play that I now notice, because obviously Derek Lalonde is highlighting them for me right there, that I would have never really intentionally picked up on, or little elements that I now know to watch for next year. And I plan to write about those sooner than later after I kind of diagnose all this information and all that stuff. But so that was really interesting. And this is an interesting conference where you have Derek Lalonde here speaking about that. You've got Ryan Huska, the coach of the Calgary Flames, speaking. But one of the things that was interesting to me is they have I think it really applies to this show, is they are having specific video and analytics sessions now, which are less attended. It's actually funny. They're less attended some of the other ones, because I think that video analytics scares a lot of people, and I think even coaches are like, oh, I'll go to the one where they're teaching how to power skate right now instead of the space. But for me, yesterday the Winnipeg Jets, the video coach for the Winnipeg Jets spoke yesterday, and one of the really interesting things he brought up, and just the way, and this is a technology thing more than an analytic thing, but one of the things the Jets did this year, for example, that I would have I don't know if anyone would have any idea of this. Every year, Prashanth, we think of the pregame schedule for a game. It goes morning skate, and there's the penalty kill and power play meeting, right? The Jets this year moved their penalty kill meeting to the night before, completely virtual. They no longer do a day of penalty kill meeting at the rink. And the reason being for that was they're like, well, since we use a lot of the same guys on the power play and the penalty kill, their attention is already kind of split. They're naturally goal scorers. They are going to be thinking about the power play meeting. That's the more interesting meeting, and the penalty kill one. And so basically what they did was they took the penalty kill meeting, they repackaged it to a presentation, to a video, where they send it to everyone in the penalty kill meeting. They all watch it, and then they have a meeting about it afterwards. It's no longer a lecture. We're giving the information to the guys, and then they're bringing it, and then And then we're having that discussion over Zoom the night before. And they said just from a penalty killing perspective and everything, like all of a sudden now they would get questions from players where they didn't, or maybe there was a lack of understanding that they would have never asked before in the old format. Whereas the old format, it's kind of quick. You've got 20 minutes in the room, 20 minutes for a penalty kill meeting, then the power play guys are coming in. And so these questions would have never been really asked. And now instead it's either asked in that Zoom, or there'll be times players come in the next morning before the morning skate and say, hey, I was thinking about this. So there's some intricacies to that I think are very interesting on the back end. And they were talking about how the Jets, in this case, there's an example, are looking at maybe using this model for the power play meeting next year as well, to how can we limit the amount of time guys have to spend at the rink with this technology. That was really interesting to me. There's a couple video coaches who have spoken. There's the coach from the video coach from the Minnesota Wild, and the video coach from the Washington Capitals as well. And she did give a tremendous presentation on just kind of how the Capitals essentially kind of give a ton of autonomy, more than I would have ever expected, and no disrespect to a video coach, but a little bit more autonomy to the fact of this is how you break something down, and a bit of the feedback that can go into practice. And then the other one, and this goes back to the other big thing, just so we talk about real world analytic usage. A lot of the times on this show, we talk about on ice data and everything like that. And I think I'd love to have a guest on at some point. We're going all over the place with our guests, which is great. But at some point, I'd love to have someone on who can kind of go into the sports science side of things. And one of the things is how the University of Michigan is now using, under Brandon Naruto, is now kind of really dialing deeper into the sports science side to analytically plan practices. Naruto, last year, he was the interim coach last year. He's now the head coach. One of the first things he did last year when he got the interim tag was he hired a full-time data analyst, and and I'm not making this number up. It popped when he said it first, but he got 13 student analysts on staff. 13 data analyst students on staff to break down data and everything like that. And the big one that they used the most was, and you saw, if anyone watched Michigan hockey this year and how they play very fast. They played a puck possession style. Obviously, they reached the Frozen Four. They were a team that played a style that is not easy, and energy-wise is probably not maintainable outside a college schedule, just because college you get the full 5 days off and everything like that. I don't know how maintainable it would be with an NHL workload, but for college hockey, it's very, very different than everyone else plays. And one of the things they were able to do to be able to play that way was using their data department, basically. This is a college, and this is the advantage of being a school that has such a big department in this. This is obviously not equal playing field. They basically were using the body monitoring, the body tracking, like the stuff from practice, which, and you may know more about this than I do, but he's like, apparently they can get 300 points of data per second from practice, where it can measure impact on players, it can measure heart rates, it can measure everything on a player. And they were able to figure out the best way and they basically labeled drills red, yellow, and green. And they were able to basically build up practices where, using that data, where this is how you maximize energy for Friday and Saturday night, and how you probably don't run 2 red drills back to back. You probably only, and how you build and you use that data to make yourself more informed for the energy of your players when it comes to Friday and Saturday. And I think that's something where we often talk about analytics and we talk about the on-ice stuff, as I said, but that off-ice stuff, that other stuff where NHL teams are probably even more scared to tell us what they do. It was a nice little curtain peel back of how this data can be used on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes you'll be in an NHL locker room and you'll see the guys will have the heart monitor after practice and they hand it over to the trainer. The player has no idea what any of that means, but it gives you a better idea of the trainers taking that information. We use Detroit, for example. The trainers use taking that information and giving it to the coaching staff and might be like, you know what, hey, you played Mo Sider 28 minutes the other night. he goes through this type of energy usage in practice. Maybe we give him an optional, or maybe we tell him to take the optional. Like it's that side of kind of the data usage that I think. We're 11 episodes into this show, so we're always young in our show, so we can always say we talked about it early on. But I don't know if we've talked about that really much yet in our own show here.
Yeah, I mean, the biometric aspect is an area that I think fascinates a lot of people because, it's how much information can you really learn about the human body and in terms of what folks are able to do. We've really seen the application largely be, okay, how quickly does a player recover? How quickly can a player, achieve their kind of peak performance, whether it's, VO2 max or whatever they're sort of looking at as being that representative factor. But ultimately, like what you're coming away with from this conference is what I think scares a lot of people about analytics, but is also should be exciting about analytics, in that there's a wealth of information out there. And if you take the time to go out and find it, and you take the time to understand it, and you take the time to figure out ways to apply it, you have opportunities to gain legs up, because, there's always ways that you can gain information to help you understand kind of what those best practices are. And it goes all the way down to, how hard should you work this player in practice? What is the best way to sequence the drills to make sure that I'm not, going into that red zone. And folks may have experience with this in their own personal life. Like, for example, people that go to Orange Theory, it's a popular fitness program, but if you've ever been there, you have to wear a heart rate monitor, and you actually get what's called splat points based on where your heart rate's at. And they actually tell you an optimal target, based on your max and kind of how much time you should spend there in a workout. And so all of that, I think, is just super fascinating information, and really exciting to see coaches being willing to share, different practices of what they're doing. And, Brandon Arruda was a very smart guy. Obviously, folks may be familiar with him as a player development coach with the Red Wings for I think back in 2021 before he left to join Michigan. So, all of that being said, fascinating information, and that's the kind of stuff we hope you expect here on Expected by Whom, a podcast that's exploring the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. We know a lot of you tuning in are Red Wings fans, and the Wing Wheel Podcast is the biggest and best Detroit Red Wings show out there. Find the show wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts, and go to wingwheelpodcast.com for more. I'm trying to be more and more creative with how I find the ways to segue into that read there. And so
is that a hint, nudge, nudge to Ryan of call Orange Theory to get sponsorship for the
Might as well. I did that back when I was in residency, and it was a great way to get some exercise. I don't do that anymore. Now actually probably doesn't make sense to anybody here, but I box 2 or 3 times a week. I don't know that I've really ever talked about that, but Orange Theory would be a great sponsor, but it's another way that you get biometric information. I think the important caveat, though, before we move on to the next segment, that I want to offer is you can get as much information as you want, but you have to understand what it's telling you. And I think that's the step that sometimes we miss. And I'll give you an example of this. Brandon Arruda was giving this presentation at Coaches Conference. Everybody's probably taking it away that this is incredible information. But at the same time, if you flip the other side of the token and you look at the NHL Draft Combine, and they go through all of these sort of performance, testing, and we get all the results from that. But you see a lot of people being incredibly dismissive of it. Oh, well, what does it actually tell me? Well, if there are folks that have figured out what to do with that information and what that may tell you about, okay, what does a player's VO2 max tell you about their aerobic performance and their anaerobic performance and what they're able to do? And then similarly, does any of the other combine testing actually translate to a useful skill? If you find the people that are willing to show you what that information actually tells you and ties it to outcomes, that's when you can have really good usage of the information. Otherwise, you deal with information overload where you have so much information and you have no idea what to do with it. So there is a point where you can have too much and not necessarily have quality information. And that's where you have people that know how to sift through that information, find what's quality, and then figure out how to apply it.
And I think one of the biggest things about all of this is, how do you connect data to the layman, right? Well, layman's the wrong term, but the layperson, whatever, right? Like, how do you connect data and how do you make it actually matter to you, right? And I think so often we get the like, oh, well, this guy's vertical jump and this guy's height, and we get all of the, height and weight, that's obvious, but whatever. But we get the VO2 max, we get the vertical jump, we get the shuttle run, we get all that stuff. And those are the type of things where it's not going to impact, like Connor Bedard, for example. He's going to be drafted number 1, even if he had a crappy VO2 max space, right? Like, the Blackhawks are still taking him number 1 no matter what. But him taking part in that combine, having those data, the Blackhawks now have a data point that before development camp, whenever development camp is for Chicago and everything like that, and before training camp, they can go to their sports science department and they have data points already for Connor Bedard of, okay, we have to make sure this kid is in the best possible shape to play 82 games and rescue this franchise. These are data points now where getting the data point from Bedard at the combine, they'll probably do the same test at the development camp. They'll probably do the same test right before the season. These are all things that all of a sudden it's more data that you can properly use over time. And I think a lot of the times we put this data out, this data gets out, or these things go to people, and it's not for you, right? And so like, you're not the intended recipient of it. And so you don't know how to deal with it. So you joke about it or you kind of laugh at it. And I think that's kind of that's the other key is like, who is the data actually for? Like, there's certain, like, of all the NHL tracking data, right? One of the most fun ones for the casual viewer, but has no impact at all on coaching staff, is shot speed. Like, it'll be like it's like, oh, so-and-so fired a slap shot 94 miles an hour. That's a broadcast tool. I think that's the other part of it. That's the data. That's the analytic that is supposed to be used on the broadcast. That's the one that's supposed to be used for the fan and the person at home. It's like, oh, 94 miles an hour. Like, that's 20 miles an hour faster than I was driving earlier. Or I know what that is compared to a baseball pitcher. Like I think the intended audience and who the data for is just sometimes it muddles the message. And I think that's the thing that it's one of the big parts of, like, as hockey's going forward and as more and more people, as more teams embrace this, and this is going to start going at lower levels too. It's obviously right now what University of Michigan's able to do because they have such a large department as opposed to even some other college teams. But as this gets more and more spread, the difference becomes more and more, the playing field gets more even, but the differences start to become more noticeable of who's good at actually cutting through the noise and who's cutting through the and cutting through, okay, what doesn't actually matter, what does matter, because there's so much data where, like we had Andrew on, and we talk about all of those tracking points that are on the ice all the time. If you could spend an entire year trying to go through every single data point from one game, and what would that leave you? That would just leave you wasting a year. But if you knew what you were trying to go through, if you knew what you're trying to isolate, it becomes so much better. And that's kind of the next step for teams when it comes to data and it comes to technology and everything like that. It's so much more about streamlining the information process, streamlining the retention, and it's an interesting space. I mean, that's how teams are using it. To me, is really interesting because I think I always like getting these little insights at something like this because, like, I loved when we had Eric on, and it was and it was like, we asked him, like, how do teams use this across the league? And he said, like, I honestly can't give you the true answer. We can at least start, you and I talk to enough people where we can at least start to try to piece it together. So I feel like we're at least kind of trying to build ourselves as the authority of, maybe you and I can create the spreadsheet someday of like, well, we know this about 12 teams.
Yeah, ultimately you hit the nail on the head that it's how you sift through that information. It's how you figure out what's really important, and it's ultimately how you apply and communicate it. And I think the communication aspect is something we've tried to highlight through multiple interviews that we've done, talking to Eric about his experience, talking to Andrew Thomas about his experience working in the Minnesota Wild front office. Ultimately, what it takes for these to be successful, these partnerships and these scenarios to be successful, is having people that are open-minded, willing to sort of cross the bridge to the other side, the other way of thinking, and being open to ideas that challenge maybe the way that they've perceive things. But what it really comes down to is, if you want to bring that new case in, you've got to have this is what the information is, this is what it's telling us, this is why it's important, and this is how it impacts us moving forward. Having that understanding of what that data is giving you ultimately helps you make better decisions moving forward. And so, what we're going to do now is we're going to go to another interview on a topic that everybody universally hates except for accountants. And I have to say that in pure jest, because this was honestly one of the most fascinating interviews we've ever done. And so what we're going to do now is, we're about a week out from free agency, and inevitably there will be some conversation about state income tax, the Jock tax, how Florida and Texas and Vegas are running away with the league because they don't have to deal with the income tax component. So we've brought on Kyle Stitch from AFP Analytics. He's the director of operations for AFP Tax and AFP Analytics, and he's going to give us an in-depth overview of how much income tax rates really impact an NHL player's take-home pay. How the Jock tax actually works, all the way down to the city level. Who's responsible for keeping up with this stuff. It's a fascinating conversation, and so we're going to transition over to that. And so without any further ado, let's bring on Kyle.
Okay, and we are happy to be joined today by Kyle Stitch he is the director for AFP Tax and AFP Analytics, and we're going to talk about something where I'm excited about this one because I'm excited about all our interviews. But Kyle shot me a message after I had mentioned wanting to talk about this at some point on the podcast maybe in a month ago or so. And so, Kyle, thanks for coming on. How you doing today?
Yeah, no problem. I'm doing great. It's interesting to have someone actually excited to talk some tax with me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I'm not doing them right now, but it's good to talk about other people's taxes, I guess is the best way to put it. But to start us off, just kind of give our listeners kind of an idea. Can you tell us a little bit more about what AFP Tax Consulting does? I know, and you can kind of give us an idea of who you work with, athletes, you work with clients. Kind of give us an idea of what AFP Tax Consulting does.
Yeah, so we've been in business about 20 years now, originally founded by Alan Progashevsky. Both of us in the past have worked at times with formerly Sports Consulting Group, now Bartlett Hockey. We're based out of Rochester, New York. And our goal is to help those that have very kind of complex tax situations in the sport industry and help them properly file in their taxes in not only the US, in Canada, and then all the states that they're required to file their taxes in. So we have about 400 clients. Most of them work in the sport industry in some capacity, either as athletic trainers, front office, coaches. Then we have lots of athletes, mostly in the sport of hockey. The athletes play anywhere from the ECHL to the AHL to we have about 40 to 50 NHL guys that we work with, as well as a lot of guys who play over in Europe. So we've seen pretty much it all as it relates to hockey. And then we have a couple of people here and there from other sports, a couple athletes here and there from other sports. But yeah, our wheelhouse is pretty much hockey.
That's awesome. I think for me personally, I was not aware of the history of how long, the company's really been around and, how involved it's been. And so it's kind of awesome to hear, how tied into the sport and how many different individuals, sort of seek out, you guys to be able to work with your expertise. I want to shift gears a little bit to, one of the things we're going to be talking about real soon here is free agency. And, thanks to the success of Tampa, the success of Vegas, this most recent Stanley Cup final featuring Vegas and Florida, states without individual income tax, the tax rate or lack of taxes is kind of being a hot topic, particularly as we look to players who may be looking to move this free agency. What are some of the truths and maybe what are some of the misnomers you see when people are discussing kind of the importance of income tax rate for these players making their decisions?
So first off, it matters. It definitely matters. States with no income tax. So we have Florida, we have Tennessee, we have the state of Washington, Nevada, Texas, at least with NHL teams. They provide about, so I ran quickly about a $3 million contract. So that's about the average NHL salary right now. They provide, kind of more money in the player's pocket of about $400,000 when compared to the very worst case situations, which are like your California teams and your New York City, your New York Rangers particularly. And we can talk a little bit more kind of how that breaks down and everything. So it matters. It absolutely matters. It's not necessarily a linear scale. So like it's as the earnings grow or shrink a little bit, we're not necessarily saying it's always that same kind of ratio or anything, but it matters. $400,000 on, $3 million is a nice chunk of change. But at the same point, it also isn't going to be the only driving decision. Like you still want to, if you're a player, you still want to put yourself in a position where you're going to feel comfortable, where you're going to feel like if you want to win, you're not going to go to a team just because they have a great state income tax situation. You're still going to choose the team that's successful. But I think that this is where Tampa Bay, as they built kind of their dynasty type team, has been able to leverage their situation in. So yeah, players are taking less contract value, but they're probably putting as much money in their pocket as if they were to go to some of these kind of organizations in different situations, strictly because of the tax advantage that the state of Florida provides them. And I think one thing that's really important and interesting to point out is we've had these calculations going for years at this point. And in 2017, there was a new tax law passed at the U.S. federal level, called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And that actually widened the gap. So basically since 2017, the states with no income tax have had even more of an advantage that compared to some of those higher state taxes. And that's directly basically attributable to the new tax law that was placed in, that was due to the new state tax law that was put in place in 2017.
That's fascinating. I don't think I would have ever pieced that together. So appreciate you sharing that. So to sort of recap, when we talk about an average NHL contract of, a yearly salary being $3 million, a player receiving that contract in a income tax free state would likely take home an extra $400,000 compared to, somebody maybe playing in California or New York City. Along those lines, and obviously without getting into any sort of specific situations, do you think that since that 2017 act has been placed, in your opinion, does that sort of rise to the level of a competitive advantage? Because I think that's what a lot of folks are really interested in is it a competitive advantage for Tampa, for Florida, for Vegas, for Dallas, to have that situation where, as you said, the player can go there, receive a lower salary, but actually get the same take home as they potentially would in another state.
Yeah, I do think if you can start building a team and attract players that are interested in winning, and oh, by the way, you can also put more money in their pocket, I think it absolutely does play an advantage. And I think there's a level also where the Canadian teams are at a distinct disadvantage. So there's certainly some tax planning strategies that you can take advantage of to maybe lessen that tax burden playing in Canada. But the reality is over the past few years, some of the Canadian provinces have been raising their rates to a pretty high extent. And based off of kind of a player being in one of those states, not necessarily planning correctly, the three worst situations right now in the NHL from a tax standpoint are Vancouver, Toronto, and Ottawa, with Montreal not far behind either. So yeah, there is definitely a disparity, and it is a factor.
I think one of the things that gets kind of lost in because people use the people, and I'm not saying that the people shouldn't be doing this, but we'll sometimes see people throw the blanket because it doesn't fit in a tweet that players are also, you may be playing for a non-state tax team, but when Florida goes to, we have a large Detroit relationship, obviously. You go to Detroit, you're paying taxes when you go and play in Detroit. When you're going to, so let's talk about the Jock tax. Can you help us explain to the listeners, particularly for visiting players, and I know there's some for some places it's state related, and there's some cities like here in Detroit where there's a city tax as well. Can you kind of help us go through what the Jock tax is? Because I think that sometimes gets lost, where even though you're playing for the Florida and Vegas, it was easy because they were just flying back and forth to new non-state taxes. But when when those teams go to New York or Detroit or whatever, there's now another tax situation for those players.
Yeah. So, well, how long we got? We got time, I guess, to get into this. But so let's break this down a little bit. So tax is based off of where you are considered a resident. Starting there. So you live in the United States, you pay tax to the US. If you live in Canada, you pay tax to Canada. There's some planning strategies and everything that you can shift your kind of where you're a resident a little bit. But simply, if you're in Canada, you pay to Canada. US, you pay to US. If you're a US citizen, you pay to the US regardless. And then it matters where you live as a state and even some cities. So if you're a resident, if you live in Michigan, you pay tax on all of your earnings in the state of Michigan. And now similarly, if you are, let's say you're living in the greater Detroit area, they impose a tax, and there's other cities in the NHL that do so as well. Columbus, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, all also impose a tax. So if you live in Detroit, you also pay tax on your full income to the city of Detroit. Now, if you're an away player, you're hit with those exact same taxes. So we'll stick with the Red Wings as the example here. So you play in Detroit, you're playing with the Red Wings, live in Michigan, live in Detroit area. So you're paying U.S. federal tax, you're paying tax to the state of Michigan, paying tax to the city of Detroit. Let's say you go and play a game in California. You go on the California swing, which is usually around 5-6 days, which is actually incredibly important for calculating how much they owe to the state of California. So you owe tax to the state of California for every single day you're present. So I think one of the kind of interesting misnomers is it's labeled Jock tax, but it's really a non-resident tax. And so it's not necessarily applicable to just athletes here. It's applicable to anyone who's traveling and earning income in different areas. So if you're even just a reporter and traveling with the team, you probably should be paying tax in those cities that you're earning your income as well. The reason that, sorry, Sean, the reason that it's don't a little bit,
that, please.
So the reason that athletes kind of get the brunt of this is because it's incredibly easy to know that they're in the state. You can look up their box score, see, oh yeah, that guy scored a couple goals. Oh, he played 10 minutes in the next game, etc. It's really easy to tell that Detroit Red Wing player was in California for that stretch of time. So that's kind of the difference between ordinary people and athletes. Easy to track. So how do you calculate how much tax they owe to California? Well, it's based on what's known as duty days. So a duty day starts when the player is required to be with the team. So in the NHL, any optional off-season activities, same with other leagues as well, are not included until you hit that training camp where they're required by team to be with them, as long as they're under contract. And the duty days add up until the end of the season, whether that's the regular season or if they make the playoffs, they continue to accumulate duty days. So basically you're creating a ratio where that's your denominator and it's usually around 207 days if training camp to the end of regular season. So let's say Detroit goes to California for a 6-game road trip. That's the number of days spent in California. So they're earning 6 divided by 207 days of their salary in the state of California. And then they pay tax under California law on that basically amount. So that's already complicated enough. But they've basically paid tax on that money in Michigan because they owe everything to Michigan. And they've paid tax to California. So one of the basically laws that each state has in place is they will allow a credit for up to the tax that they imposed on that income. So let's easy numbers here. Let's say Michigan taxed $500 on the income earned in California, and they paid $1,000 to California in tax. Well, Michigan only would tax $500. So they get a credit. So they reduce their kind of overall liability by $500, but they're still out that extra $500 in California. And where the cities get interesting is there's no credit for cities. So let's flip the scenario. If you're a California team visiting Detroit, so sure, your entire tax that you paid at Michigan is going to be kind of refunded in California because it's a lower tax rate in Michigan than California. They don't refund the city tax rate. So any city that the player plays in, they're hit with an additional kind of amount.
So what you're basically saying is you have to either have a PhD in economics or have a business school degree to be able to keep up with all of this. Because, I mean, that's just the level of granularity that goes into this is incredible. And so I think the simple question for me as a relatively simple-minded person when it comes to this stuff, who keeps track of all of this? Like, you know, when you're working with your clients, like, is it the NHL team's responsibility? Is it your responsibility as the consultant, the agent, the taxing entity? Like, how does that all sort of come together?
So the answer is there's really no good answer, and it kind of is dependent on the state. It's an absolute, I don't want to say full on Wild West, but we try our best to reflect the income properly. So the onus is always on the taxpayer to properly report their income. I think really where the question comes in is what are states acknowledging as the proper income? So we will go through every tax season, pull every team's schedule and basically set up how many days they were in each place for the calendar year, how many total days. And we'll have that all set up so we can just kind of plug their whatever their earnings were for the year in and spit out how much they earned in each place they played. So we try and do that, and we try and be as proactive as possible, but it really is complicated in that each state acknowledges what the proper earnings are in different ways. So California is probably the most aggressive in enforcing or sticking to the law. So they will go through, and we've gotten plenty of nice notices from them saying, hey, your salary that you reported wasn't reported correctly. And almost every single time, they're dead on. They're right. So we've gotten to the point where, depending on what our calculation is for California, we make sure that we're reporting that properly to try to get out ahead of any issues. It doesn't necessarily matter. So at the end of every year, any U.S. taxpayer, who made money in the U.S. gets what's called a Form W-2, and that reports how much earnings you had for the year. So the team and their payroll department will keep track and allocate salary however they have their methods set up. And each state, so we'll have multiple pages sometimes of these W-2s. So an ordinary person probably gets one page. The athletes we're dealing with will have anywhere 13 to 16 pages that we have to kind of sift through. And some states will look at what's on that as the correct official amount, even if going through and following the law comes to a different calculation. So each state kind of has a different way of how they want to recognize it. Is it following the law to a T like California does, or some other states are pretty much accepting whatever the team reported, whether that's less or more, as correct on what was reported on the kind of year-end wage statement. We've even had some states kind of question us giving them more money because it's different from what's on the wage slip.
So just kind of one of the things we talk a lot about the United States factor. How does it work? Because this is the NHL, and now baseball has a team in Toronto, the NBA has a team in Toronto, but it's one spot. How does it work is there a jock tax when the Red Wings, for example, fly to Ontario? Is there how does it work now with the Canadian factor? Because obviously in the NHL, it's the biggest of the major sports in the United States, in North America.
So it's actually those days are bonus days. They actually help teams with lowering their tax liability to other places, because based on there's a U.S. Canadian tax treaty. So there's an agreement in place that if you're paying tax in the United States on that income, you don't get double tax. So you don't have to pay tax in Canada, and the Canadian provinces follow that same thing. So if Detroit travels up to Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, does a little eastern kind of East Coast stretch there, it's the exact same as far as calculating their overall income and liability in other states as if they were to make a Florida stretch and play Florida, Tampa. The impact on their tax and earnings is exactly the same.
So it's actually, when if you're a team, we this actually just pops in my head right now. We often hear about guys being happy to go home to Toronto to play games as visitors. There's actually even more there's even a residual impact there, right? Of you're actually saving some money that you could have been if by having an extra day in Toronto as opposed to Boston on the same road trip, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly. So, going back to when kind of COVID hit and the teams went up into the bubble, for example, so like a team like Vegas, income tax free state, when they went up into the bubble, they're increasing kind of that denominator in the fraction. So they're adding to the number of days, but the number of days that were in California stayed the same. So when you take a number and divide it by a bigger number, the kind of salary allocation is going to go down. So yeah, the more days. So yeah, teams want to stay in Vegas for, the obvious reason, but they're actually saving money by spending that extra day in Vegas opposed to going over to California. Arizona's not too bad, but there is still a tax rate in Arizona. So staying in Vegas, staying in Washington, up in any of the Canadian teams, staying in Florida for an extra day is also benefiting the players financially.
That's That's absolutely fascinating to just think about. And, for you to so succinctly break it down for us and for all of the listeners is absolutely tremendous, because these are incredibly important factors. And while they, as you alluded to at the beginning, they're not going to be the single most important factors for most players. Obviously, winning culture, playing where they want to, play and things along those lines are certainly going to contribute. But this is very important information to consider. And there's not really been a great explainer of this in the public space, beyond just kind of general talk of escrow and whatnot. So I really want to thank you just for spending the time going over the Jock tax, the income tax, and helping us break it down. Beyond this, can you tell us about some things you guys are working on at AFP and what we can look forward to seeing?
Yeah. So if you're, So if you're an agent player and you're interested in kind of getting help or anything with situating yourself in a good tax situation or planning as free agencies open, we always welcome providing advice, connecting, and everything. And then on the analytics side, me and my partner James Finch, we've been doing contract projections for about 4 years as well, kind of as a alternative to evolving hockey. And we kind of look at ours and theirs as probably the two gold standards right now. Him and I have just launched our own podcast, Max Term Podcast, where we talk about kind of where the business and analytics side of things meet. So if you're listening to this podcast and interested in this type of content, we got more and we're trying to stay as neutral as we can in the NHL and kind of look around the league. But yeah, if anyone's interested in learning more or anything, also feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at K_STICHER or, at AFP Analytics. And, we'd, welcome to answer any of your questions.
I have one more question that just popped up as we're going through this as just a randomly thought. So we think of, April 15th is right, or was it 18th? It's always like mid-April is always comes up as tax day, right? We often think about NHL players and we think about the season as something that it's an entity that goes from August, from basically September when they report to camp to late to May for most of them, depending on how late they go in the playoffs. But for this purpose, and it's just interesting because we've got free agency coming up, this is popping in my head right now, where you'll have when let's take a big, like we'll have like we talked about Alex DeBrincat on our last show. He's someone who, and his next, if he's in Ottawa, if say he's not in Ottawa, just for hypothetical reasons only, if he's not in Ottawa, his next year's tax earning will be based off of where he signs for somewhere here, half a year of Ottawa. Like that's a whole nother complication that I hadn't ever even thought about this until you said, "Hey, throw me your questions on Twitter right now." So I'm leading the charge right now and bringing up random things that pop into my head, I guess. So.
Yeah. So as much as like the tax deadline, mid-April. Or end of April for Canadian is important. This time of the year is just as important, and even like trade deadlines important as well. So trade deadline often happens before we file a lot of the NHL players' taxes. So sometimes if they're traded at that deadline, it's going to impact the strategy that we use. But if they sign in the kind of off season here, sometimes, I mean, I just ran some scenarios yesterday for a free agent to kind of show like, okay, here would be the impact of signing with any of these teams. So if you want to base your decision on financials alone, here's kind of the ramifications of doing so. So yeah, we're trying to position the players, as much in the summer, as much in the off season, looking to buy a house someplace, looking to move, looking to sign with a new team. That's almost as important to kind of proactively plan and see where you're at, as well as if you're getting a signing bonus or anything. A lot of the players that we see have kind of tax deficits when they file their income taxes are because they received a signing bonus during the year. So kind of being proactive and understanding where their tax situation is in the middle of the year, and then as kind of the calendar year comes to a close. So it's the fall and the spring are what come together to make the tax year, even though they're two separate NHL seasons. So kind of looking at each team independently, looking at each situation at the end of the year is absolutely important, and trying to be proactive sometimes instead of reactive is kind of one of the other things that we try and emphasize.
This is all, I mean, the tax stuff, it's always a very simplified Twitter quick hit thing but there's obviously so much nuance to it. So Kyle, thank you so much for taking the time to join the show to help us try to translate it to a little bit more simpler terms for our listeners. So thank you so much. And I'll let you take it out real quick. Where can people follow you again so they can follow more of your work on here?
Yeah, so I would say the best three places: my personal Twitter at K_Stitcher1T, at AFP Analytics, and then our new podcast at Max Term Pod. We appreciate people checking that out as kind of the way to support our work. And our contract projections are free, publicly available, pinned to at AFP Analytics, if anyone's interested in those as well.
Honestly, one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had about taxes. That was really great. And not that we didn't expect to learn a lot from Kyle when he came on, but some of the things that he brought up about some of the things that I had, some of the misnomers that lots of reporters, myself included, may have not covered before. I thought that was a great segment on here. And this episode is going to be one where when I see someone tweeting about state income taxes or confusion or whatever, I'm just going to have this one bookmarked to share with others.
Yeah, I mean, we always said that this podcast was going to be about connecting analytics and human elements, and taxes is as human of an element as it gets, as for all of us here in North America. And so, can't thank Kyle enough for being willing, as someone who works in this space on a day-to-day basis and works with these athletes, to be able to come in and kind of share his experience and share this information with us. And, if you'd like to support our show, please subscribe to the Wing Wheel Podcast on Patreon. It's patreon.com/Wing Wheel Podcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like the Wing Wheel Podcast exclusive Discord, which has an Expected by Whom dedicated channel, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're a part of the Wing Wheel Podcast Content Network, and you allow us to bring these types of interviews in where we can talk about concepts that folks really aren't comfortable about, with experts who can break it down to the most simplistic way possible. All right, so to close us out here, before we get to free agency and talking about income tax and the Jock tax, we first have to get through the NHL draft. We have the NHL draft coming up on June 28th, and down in Nashville for everybody who will be there. I will not. Sean will. If you are there and you see Sean, buy him a beer. Make sure you get to have a good time with him.
We should say, like, if we're going to be, I'm not going to go and organize something, but if anyone's listening to the show and you want to, I mean, I'm flying to Nashville Sunday. I'll be there through the draft. So if anyone who listens to the show ever wants to talk some hockey, have a beer or whatever, my DMs are open for that. Give your complaints to Ryan, but if you want to get a beer and you want to talk hockey, you can send the message directly to me.
Exactly. So basically it comes down to anything positive, reach out to Sean. Anything that is a complaint, please reach out directly to Ryan. But let's talk about one of the questions that comes up all the time: trading up versus trading down, kind of where the value lies. And is there anything unique about this 2023 draft? I know you've spent some time, obviously, in your other writing role, working for Elite Prospects and EP Ringside, doing a lot of work over there. You get to see how much effort really goes into scouting these prospects. Tell us a little bit about kind of your impressions of this class and how that may impact the trade up and trade down philosophy.
For me, one of the things I learned a while ago is to let the people who cover these prospects all year long and scout them all year long, let them write all the pieces. It's always, I get why people need to localize content and stuff like that, but I see so many people that cover teams or whatever, they try to write these draft profiles of someone could draft at 16, 17 or whatever. And I 4 or 5 years ago made the realization that I will never be in my 3 hours of research on a kid, I will never be able to get what these people who have been covering the draft from the year before and maybe even 18 months prior have gotten on these guys. So like, that's why I turn to, like, if you want to know more about a draft prospect, I just turn right to the Elite Prospects Draft Guide. I just Control F and I source it all right through them, because I'm never going to be able to. But having seen that built out, having talked to our guys over at EP Rinkside and kind of how this draft goes, like, it's a good draft. It's now it's the top of the draft is obviously we all know who number 1 is. We're all 90% sure that Fantilli is going to go number 2, but there's a chance Carlson could go number 2. But then, and I mean, like, the only true wild cards that people are debating, where people like is, okay, is there a wild card of who could go number 2? Could Carlson leap Fantilli, and how high up does Matvey Michkov go? Because a lot of people believe that he probably has the second highest ceiling of anyone in this draft class, and that's it's a great question in all this. But so it brings me to the concept of trading up versus trading down. And I really like the app you built out, where you kind of take the rankings across the board and kind of bring where these players have kind of gone and risen and fallen across on various things. And you always hear about people talking about, oh, trade up, should we trade up for this guy or whatever? And I've come more and more to the theory, unless you can situationally give me the proper reason to trade up. So like this draft, for example, if you can trade up to get Michkov, I think you do that, right? Like that's what you would do. But otherwise, I think with how players are so fickle in development paths and go, and I look at how far the spread is on where some guys are, I've become a big proponent of, like, I'm always going to be the team willing to trade down. I'm always going to be the team willing to have, if I can get I'd rather have 17 and 35 than have 15 or 13 or whatever. Like, I've come to more and more of that mindset, where I'd rather have 2 scratch off tickets in the top 45 than have 1, because that's ultimately what these prospects are. I really like the tool you built, because you can kind of see it. It's like, you'd be like, oh, well, like any guy, almost any draft pick, you look and you're like, okay, somebody from an outside scouting service if almost anyone you pick in the top 30, somebody from an outside scouting service has had that player in the top 15. If you're telling me that there's a guy that, and now obviously could be some odd rankings or whatever here and there, but in general, if it's such a wide disparity after kind of those top 3, 4, 5 guys, why wouldn't you just try to get as many as you want from that pool? And so I've just come more and more of like a trade back, build up as many guys as possible guy. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. So, I do a lot of individual work just for myself in this space. I watch a lot of the video, watch a lot of, the tape on these guys. And while I'm admittedly not a hockey scout in any way, I also look at all of the numbers that go into, their performance, including some of the deeper analytics there as well. And I have come away with a overarching conclusion that I'm going to then expand upon in a lengthier rant here. We simply just do not give enough consideration to how wide the range of possible outcomes are for an individual prospect, all the way to the top of the draft. Okay. We talked about Alexis Lafreniere being one of the better prospects to come out. You go back and you read everybody's scouting assessment. He was an unquestioned 1 for the most part. There's maybe a couple outlets that had Quinton Byfield going at 2, but arguably the best player, in that 2020 draft, a huge prize for the New York Rangers to be able to win that. And then ultimately you see that he's really struggled in the first few years there. And that's just a one-off example, but I want to use that to highlight that the range of outcomes are incredibly wide for players. There are certain teams that may be better at developing certain types of players based on the development staff that they have. A prospect's development is not entirely dependent on their own ability. Where they end up going to, and the staff that they get to work to develop them, the leagues that they play in after the draft, there's a huge amount of time that passes before they're really hitting the NHL. And so ultimately what we're seeing here is there's just a huge range of potential outcomes. This player, we'd say, okay, this player's ceiling is this and their floor is this. That's maybe what we think of it right now. But if we could have the ability to add error bars to those estimates, they would be very expansive for just about every player. And so I think that's just so important to understand. And where this is all leading me in this trade up versus trade down argument is you should really only be trading up if your confidence in that player's projection and your ability to develop them is close to certain. Because otherwise, you are taking another shot at a guy that has a very wide range of outcomes where you could, and spending picks generally to move up, where those would be additional opportunities to pick players. And so if you look kind of at the last few years, teams like Carolina and Toronto have been the champions of trading back. Okay, they continue to trade back until they get to a scenario where, okay, they've got a guy who's pretty clearly in a tier above the other guys, and then maybe they'll move up a few picks to go get them using the allocation of picks that they've already collected by moving back. And you can even see this in the public rankings. You go look through, some of the public rankings from Corey Prom, and you look at some of the rankings from Elite Prospects, from the Black Book, whoever really gives you those tiers. Because what you'll see is after you get past this draft in particular, really those first 5 players, the tier then sort of goes from 6 to 20, and then maybe like 21 to 50, and then like 51 to, 120 at that point. Like that's how expansive these tiers are. And so you really have to be certain in what you think a player can be and your ability to get them there to justify trading up. Otherwise, you're sort of trading up and kind of forfeiting additional swings, if you will, because you are so confident that you're going to hit this home run. It's like, I'll make a baseball analogy here. Someone tells you, you get 5 swings to hit a home run in order to win the prize, and you say, nah, I'm going to do this in just 1 because I'm that confident. It's like, hold up here. You better be pretty darn certain you can crush this pitch because you know exactly what's coming. And you know where it's going to go, and you know where to put your bat on the ball to get it out of the park. So all that being said, I am a firm advocate of generally trading down unless you are, particularly when you're trading down in a large tier. I think where the Wings are at 9, you probably don't want to be trading down because you want to be picking the upper end of that tier because you want to pick the higher end of the 6 through 20 players. You want to have a choice earlier there at 17. Maybe not so much because now you're at the back end of that tier and you can be thinking, okay, is it worthwhile moving down? Unless there's somebody that's kind of slipping and sliding, like we talked about Mitchkov. If he's starting to slide his way down, maybe that is a time where you're confident that you move up to be able to get him. But ultimately, that's my kind of spiel on this is that it's just too uncertain right now. We have too much uncertainty, and so you might as well take advantage of that.
Speaking of uncertainty, can I tell you about, you laid out the perfect way to fix the Hockey Hall of Fame this earlier week. Can I tell you about the theory I had of how I would run a draft board if I was a team for the rounds 5 through 7?
Hit me with it.
So we talk about uncertainty, and we talk about uncertainty, and now, okay, there's always, like in every draft we go in and there's like one goalie who's like, oh, this is the guy who could go in the first round. We saw, obviously, Detroit did that with Kosa. You talk about trading up. Dallas traded up back in 2017, traded up 3 picks to get ahead to get Ottinger. But you look at where goalies come from. After the first round talent, it's basically they're coming from, they could come from anywhere. Goalies could come from anywhere. And, read Micah's, research earlier this week about how the level of goaltending, when you drop down in goaltending, the level of goaltending is even less. And with how well scouted players are now, the story of the fifth round success story is so rare. It's basically, and if it is a fifth round success story, it's more and more of the guy who becomes like a middle six guy, if anything. And the type of guy I could find the type of guy that there's hundreds of guys like. So if I was running a team, and I would be laughed off the floor, but I would do it every time until if I didn't, I would just take goalies in round 5 through 7. Honestly, I would just be like, this is the most unpredictable position. If I draft 3 goalies every year, you know what? 2 of them are going to flame out in the queue. One's going to be great out of college, but then he goes to the AHL and he's going to be exposed. Okay. Those 3 failed. Next year, I'll do it again. 3 goalies, in rounds 5, 6, and 7. And just because I'd rather use my picks on a position where there's already a natural uncertainty. Let me buy all the lottery balls on goaltending. Let me find as many on that, as opposed to drafting the overager from the WHL, who I know I'm really only drafting as a favor to the regional scout. Like this is my proposal to any team out there listening, and I'd love to see if anyone actually do it. Just from fifth round on, we just draft goalies because the position is so unpredictable that we might as well buy as many lottery tickets as possible. And once they start, if we have too many, you know what? Okay. We did such a good job developing them, we can start selling them to other people as assets. Like, if a GM listens to this show, please draft only goalies after the 4th round.
Sean, I don't know how much you've read of my prior work, but that's basically exactly what I've said, is you should not spend higher round picks on goalies because the variance compared to defensemen and forwards is just so much greater. And ultimately there's very few goalies that are going to make it all the way to the NHL, and the development tracks for them is wild. And I think what we're starting to see now, and we've talked about Vegas a ton on this, but we're almost heading in the direction of where the NFL is heading with running backs, where it's sort of a committee effort. You can't necessarily rely on your one workhorse running back, your one workhorse goaltender anymore. You have to have several different NHL caliber goaltenders that can give you at least average or at least league average goaltending, given the variance that you can have from season to season, from week to week at the position. I mean, you see when a goalie gets hot, ride their coattails like Sergei Bobrovsky, get all the way to the Stanley Cup final and have a chance there. But, you just never know when that hourglass is going to run out, when the sand turns, when Father Time hits that goalie. And so having as many chances and finding kind of, the cheaper free agents or the lower round draft picks, I think really does give you the best opportunity to maximize, sort of the capital you have with all of your draft picks.
I mean, Dustin Wolf, he's the next guy in Calgary. Dustin Wolf's a 7th rounder. And he's one of the, I don't have that whole draft class in front of me, but I remember that draft because I was covering the Stars at the time. The Stars drafted a kid by the name of Jermaine Lowen, and one of the go-to sayings in this industry, if you're trying to go into journalism and write stories about teams, is write them while you got them. And the Stars drafted Jermaine Lowen. He was an overager from the Kamloops Blazers, and he was the first player in NHL history drafted who had been born in Jamaica. Pretty cool story. But it was also one of those things where I knew he wasn't going to make it. I knew he'd be he was a 7th round pick. He happened to be drafted from a team that Tom Ghilardi also happened to own. That happens a lot in the 7th round too, where you find some sort of connection on that. And so you write that story right away because with how good scouting is, there's a reason he's an overager who's available in the 7th round. And that's just the reality of it when it comes to players. Goalies, there's at least the variance of, hey, you never know. It might be nothing, but it's the mystery box that at least has a ceiling. Where a lot of the times for skaters, there's nothing there. It's the same reason that in season for me, if I was a GM, I would have no problem ever trading like any pick after the fourth round. I wouldn't even think twice. If someone came to me like, oh, I'm a team adding at the deadline. Here, have my next 5 fifth rounders. I don't care. These are 5th round picks. So it's now obviously you'd have to be someone a little bit worthwhile for 5 years of 5th rounders, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. It's such a fascinating thing because this really forces people to just come to grips with uncertainty. I think it's a concept that a lot of people are uncomfortable dealing with. But ultimately, that's where we're at in the NHL draft. I wouldn't necessarily say, I don't like to demean it as much to say it's throwing a dart at a dartboard, because there is a little bit of precision, skill, control that goes into this. But also how you navigate up and down the draft board is critical. And that's a large reason why we built the tool that we built, myself and Jeremy Spagnolo. It's to actually illustrate the range of outcomes for prospects. So, from the public sphere alone, obviously we don't have data from NHL teams, but we have a lot of, quality outlet data from people that are reputable in this position that do have NHL sources. And you can see the range of which a player may get picked is just incredible. And so having that kind of understanding of that range and knowing how to move up and down that board really allows you the best chance to maximize what you come home with or what you take away. And then, as you said, Sean, if you end up with too much of something, you can always trade. You look at Buffalo. Buffalo has done an excellent job of that because they've drafted a handful of goalies over the years, and now all of a sudden they've got Devin Levy and they've got UPL, and now UPL maybe becomes a guy on the trade block for them, and it works out that way. So really, really, really interesting. Yeah,
we'll have the thing that we haven't had happen yet is because I was thinking about this the other day, because every year after the Stanley Cup happens, we get the recirculation of the Boston Bruins celebration tab, just because it was whoever was serving the Bruins that night took a picture of the $160,000 receipt or whatever. We've all seen it, right? Occasionally the thing we've been missing is we have yet to have someone leave an organization and just give out the list. Someone been oh, hey, I worked for the Buffalo Sabres in 2019. This was our list. We've yet to see someone spitefully leak a list. And someday, I hope it happens someday, just because I'd love to be able to be oh, they had this guy at 157th, and I would just love to see that someday. We haven't had it yet because it's the full teams are pretty good about keeping that under wraps, but it's something I was thinking about the other day of we don't get that that slip through. There hasn't been the one slip through that kind of gives us an insight into how one team worked for a draft or whatever.
One of these days, we would love that. If you're out there and you want to leak a list from 5 years out, we'll be happy to have you come on the show to be able to share that. You know where to find us on Twitter.
Can we do the anonymous thing? Can Ryan do the post edit of the garbled voice and the
Yeah, we'll just have a garbled voice leaking the list one by one.
Yes.
That way we won't even tell you what team it was. It'll be completely anonymized. That way you can get it all in. But folks, this has been another excellent episode of Expected by Whom. We appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, please direct those to the inbox of Ryan Hanna. Until next time, guys.